the DeFUD Podcast. Hello and welcome to the latest episode of the DeFUD Podcast. Today, we're super thrilled to have Ian Livingstone with us. Ian is an advisor at Snyk and previously founded two startups. First, Cape Security, and second, Manifold, which was acquired by Snyk. Today, Ian is an advisor to Snyk, who is developing Snyk's platform strategy and is also a prolific angel investor, right? So many things to juggle here. I definitely want to talk about that today. And up to 40 to 50 companies in his personal portfolio. And so as someone who spent a lot of time in the security infrastructure space, Ian's someone who Ashish and I are super thrilled to dive into this conversation with. So thanks for being here.
Awesome. I'm super excited to be here. Great time. Always fun to sit down and chat with some smart folks like yourselves. And I'm sure we'll get to some nitty-gritty cool details and maybe some hot takes as well.
That's
and
what
I
our
also,
audience is excited to hear.
yeah, that's what I'm here to do. If it's not at least entertaining, then I haven't done my job.
Well, we love to hear that. You know, making security and infra entertaining is something that Ashish and I actually, that's why we started the podcast, right? To DeFUD, but also to entertain. So one thing I want to call out for our audience here today is that, you know, you're joining us all the way from Nova Scotia. So as a multi-time founder from Nova Scotia, can you tell us maybe for some of the audience, you know, who's listening here, who are either founders today or want to be founders in the near future, talk to us as a repeat founder. Like what got you started and what's gotten you to, you know, start multiple companies?
Yeah, it's a great question. It's one of these things where I didn't wake up one day and was like, I'm going to be an entrepreneur. It kind of just happened. And, from a young age, just kept building stuff, learned to program at 12. And I think ultimately over time, it's the ability that keeps me coming back to it. It's the ability to ask like a fundamental question of like, how can we make X or Y better, right? Like, and then have a vision for an answer to that and then the opportunity to try it out. And oftentimes I think of companies are really just giant experiments. Even at massive scale, you might have some better data points, you have a better foundation underneath you, but it still continues to be an experiment of how can we continue to innovate? How can we continue to improve our customers' lives? And so that's very addicting. And I think the advantage of being, as you get further on in your career and you do more than one or two or three, you start to build up a lot of the things that make the first one, the second one were so difficult. Those parts become easier, and the things that become difficult means you can take on like bigger and broader opportunities. And so that's kind of why I come back. I think it's a fundamental joy of chasing the experiment, of asking the question of how can we make something better, running the experiment to figure that out with customers, building technology, and whatever it is, and going from it. And I think if I were to pull that back just one more layer, though, because that was very, very, very high level, like what is it about it for me, and why do I do tech in general? Like, why am I doing what I'm doing? And I think at the core of it, it was this realization in like when I was 18 or 20 is if you can do anything that expedites the course of productivity, like the delta of it, like the second derivative, so you can make our generation of productivity increase, you can actually fundamentally improve how quickly the society can get to better drugs, society can get to better energy sources, society can get to better models, right? Just by making people more productive. And one of the best places to be to do that with the software revolution is how do you make people more productive building software? It's like a layer upon a layer upon a layer. And so I often think about when my unique focus is often on how can I build technology that makes a developer or a security professional or an organization, a group of those people, or a data engineer or a platform engineer productive so they can build things at scale together and do it faster than they could before. Because that fundamentally not only enables them to compete in the marketplace and potentially compete their competitors, which is kind of what you're selling to them, but more importantly, as society as a whole, allows us to generate more stuff. And fundamentally, if we want to get to a place where we have less poverty, we just need more stuff. Economics is a question of how do we trade around a bunch of scarcity. And so if you have less scarcity, more capacity to generate well-being for everyone.
Wow, we covered a lot of topics right there, from economics to coding, right, to learning to code when you were 12, to just like the high, right, the getting better at founder skills, the more companies that you start. So I'm going to ask the maybe left field question here. If you had $10 billion and you could put that in any company today, but you had to hold that shares for, let's say, the next 80 years, right? What company would you invest in?
It's a great question. I mean, assuming it could be any company, I actually like broadly believe, and I don't know if this is left field, they definitely have the market cap now, but I would end up with a board seat, is I think it's Cloudflare. And I'll tell you why. One is there's a bunch of underlying shifts that are occurring in the way that we build internet apps, right? Today, if you were to sit down and architect an app, you're still thinking broadly about like centralized cloud. I have like a database inside a region, inside some AWS region someplace, and everything's architected around that. But I think Cloudflare represents something fundamental. And Cloudflare represents the idea of the unbundling of the centralized cloud into a series of points of presence and having compute there, and building the underlying substrate of compute and infrastructure that enables me as a developer to build an app as if it was as simple and easy to understand as the centralized cloud, but in fact, it's running everywhere. And that's why I'm excited about the company. But I actually think the reason that it gets very big is a couple different facets. One, the rise of AI and the need to have things very close and data very close to the customer and inference very close will drive more things to be closer to the edge. Two is data sovereignty will never be more important than it is today, and it'll continue to be more ever increasing, which means increasingly people want to keep data inside the geographic confines, which means they want to compute closer to them. I don't want to send my data outside the EU. I don't want to send my data to the America from Canada, as an example. I think, and the third reason and primary reason is we just know that when apps are faster, people use them more, people spend more time on the websites, and more importantly, we know that people buy more, right? And so that's a shift that is and will happen. And Cloudflare has the right infrastructure and the right mental model and is right in the right starting point to enable all of that. And more importantly, has the right founders. It's one of the only companies I know of, and I had the SVP of Emerging Tech on my own podcast, Dane, to talk about this, that has an active incubation that actually works, where they actively incubate new technology on top of their platform that finally changes the way the types of customers that they can attack. So it's not just a company that builds great infrastructure, it's a company that's very good at inventing and building new types of products on top of their core stack to enable that feature you just talked about.
Well, that's a great plug for Cloudflare. And I certainly think, especially with all the new Cloudflare workers products that they're coming out with, a lot of potential there to continue growing. So coming back to, I think, your journey as a founder, one of the topics that Ashish and I have spent a lot of time in is secrets management. And I hear that you're also passionate about this topic as well. So maybe sharing some of my kind of own challenges and perspectives about secrets management, having worked and led with engineering teams, I've often have to be in the position of giving guidance around how to manage secrets, right? And so most of that guidance today, I'm sure, as you're aware, revolves around making sure that they're not easily accessible when they're outside of a vault. And so I'm curious to hear your take on why that's not that actually sufficient in today's world.
Yeah, I think we have to take a step back and just think about like, why do we have secrets in the first place? Right? Like, what are we doing? What is this weird exhaust that exists that, developers copy and paste around their stack? They're like this fundamental requirement for building a modern application. They become increasingly more important, right, over time than they used to be. 15, 20 years ago, we cared about where's my certificates at for my core HTTPS serving infrastructure or my core PKI infrastructure so I can issue some SSH certs. Like, it was a thing that like literally like 4 people in an organization would deal with. And now we live in a world where every developer, a non-trivial amount of what they do to build a service and build a feature is connect different pieces of code running across different networks together. And so I think that's the lens and framing I often think about when secret management is like, what is this? It's this weird exhaust that comes from the fact that there's actually been like this fundamental shift in the way that we build software. Nothing's on-prem. The firewall doesn't matter. The VPC has been unbundled. At the end of the day, what a developer does today is most of the time duct taping different core primitives together. That duct tape often is a secret to some other service to implement some business logic to create some value for the company that they can give to their customers. And so you have this thing that you go and look at all of the core clouds, you go and look at the best known company associated with secrets management, HashiCorp, which is in the process of being bought by Vault and IBM, and you say, were these things and are these things really designed for the actual workflow of the average developer and the delta that's occurred over the last 10 to 15 years in the way that we build software? And so that's why I'm passionate about it and something I think about. And I also think it's a reason that we spend a lot more time as an industry talking about it. It's like the reality is the proliferation of the number of secrets we manage has become not only it's like an incredibly important attack vector, right? We lose those things, you're kind of hosed, right? That's how you get exfiltrated customer data. That's how you get your IP stolen, right? And that's how you get held ransom, because somebody left some credentials someplace. So hopefully that gives you a broad answer as to why I think it's an interesting space. I think it's a space that we're spending a lot of time as an industry thinking about, and why if you go and talk to folks in security, they're spending a lot more time thinking about it, because we're seeing a lot of paper cuts. But to come back to the core point, it's exhaust. Like nobody really wants to deal with it. It's kind of like that forgotten thing that someone says, hey, just put it in a vault, but that isn't sufficient and leads to tons of these like paper cut issues. But those paper cut issues are really important.
And so you touch upon actually this issue, right, which is a lot of paper cuts, right, that happen just like with secrets lying around, with people who can access them, right? Ashish, I think you're very passionate about discussing the blast radius, but I won't steal the thunder from you right now, right? But I think this kind of speaks to in a larger, broader category, which is non-human identity. So can you maybe give us the bridge between the relationship between secrets management and also non-human identity? Because I'm sure for the investors listening to this episode, there's been around at least probably 20 companies, many of whom Ashish and I have met, right, and talked about their products, right? What do you think about that space?
Yeah, it's a great question. So NHI, in my view, is just rebranded secrets management, but for a different audience, right? So if a secret manager is the place you put your secrets, NHI is the tool that tells you what secrets you have. And there's this sort of fundamental problem, that we have in this space. It's a short-term pain cut to help people try and quantify risk profile associated with the secrets they have. And the reason this happens, and the reason we're here is broadly, is that the security as an industry is like left in the dark today in terms of their viewpoint of what secrets exist, what permissions those secrets have, where have those secrets been, where are they going, and how do I know what risk could be associated with those things? And I think the best way to think about it is think about the average like security program. So today you've got some scanners. Those scanners might find some secrets and logs someplace, but you don't know whether they're real or not. You don't know what production systems potentially have access to them. You don't know anything about it. And so I broadly look as NHI is on one side, definitely rebranded secrets management, the fact that like the vaults don't actually extend and support any type of security workflow. And the other fact that the vaults don't actually live cross cloud, right? Like if you're using Google and CircleCI and maybe some GitHub Actions and Vercel, you actually have 4 places secrets are stored, not one place, right? And so broadly speaking, this sort of NHI stuff is about giving folks the ability to observe and understand and inventory the secrets that exist and potentially connect that to the existing spend they have around secret scanners. But at the end of the day, it's still a thing tacked off to the side of the developer workflow, a thing that's tacked off and left in the cold, yet another tool that security buys and uses, but doesn't necessarily unravel or solve the core pain point.
And so we think about like NHI and secrets management, right? The long history of it. There's also been other plays. So for example, Spiffy came out almost a decade ago now, right? And so I'd love to maybe dive into some of your hot takes around secrets management. So we talked about Vault, right? And that's a great concept around secrets management today. And going back to the history of secrets management is also Spiffy, which is more known for machine-to-machine attestation. What's the bridge there, right, in your opinion? And is there a world where the two come together?
Yeah, I think, we've been as an industry, largely been on this trend. The ultimate fundamental thing we want is identity-based access controls, which is I don't have some static string that I've shared between you, Nancy, and Ashish. I've say, hey, I'm Ian. Here's a public key that you can use to encrypt things for me, or here's a public key to verify that things came from me from a signature. And that's what we want, like finally from a security practice, because it's like just reduces the number of keys you have to manage. Ideally, that like identity is tied to some bootstrap system. So, I can trust Amazon to give Ian an identity. And so because Amazon said that Ian is Ian, then I know that Ian is Ian because I trust Amazon. Right? Like broadly, that's the world we want to live in. The problem is that when we built the internet, is we didn't include any of these things into the core protocol, right? Identity wasn't really included. It's a layer and tacked on. And I think that's also true if you go and look at the way that we came across cloud infrastructure. There isn't like some shared protocol for you to establish an identity or how I tie an identity to a workload or to a human, and then how I use that to do permissioning, authentication, authorization. Like that doesn't exist. There's no toolkit. There's some stuff in the IETF. We have some things like OAuth 2.0. But broadly, what those things did is they gave you a way to permission some credentials to do some basic workflows around how do I get federated identity from another source. And so at the end of the day, when it comes to Spiffy, Spiffy is this great thing. It was a good initiative that really hasn't realized anything. And the realize it hasn't realized anything is because at the end of the day, it's really complicated to set up. And the fundamental substrate that is required in order to make it work doesn't exist. You haven't, broadly speaking, secrets managers an ecosystem problem. You have an ecosystem of producers, people that produce credentials. You have an ecosystem of consumers, people that consume credentials. You have an ecosystem of custodians, people that hold credentials or secrets. CircleCI or GitHub being a great example. And in order to like transform the industry, you have to figure out how you get all of this entire ecosystem to move to a place in lockstep. And because we all start at different points in time, and because not everyone wants to invest in building the best possible identity system for their app or cloud service they're building, these problems have never really been resolved because it's not easy to just do these things out of the box. And so when we come and look at, why is it that secret management is basically a giant key value store today, is because there isn't like a protocol and there is nobody that's taken us from point A, which is where we are today, to the future and help you deal with all of the associated ecosystem or legacy problems associated with it. And so Spiffy is great. It's just to actually get Spiffy to work, it requires building so much that in order to get to the promised land, the investment is massive. And I think that's fundamentally been the actual problem in this space for a very long time, is the amount you have to build to see any of the upside is so huge. And then even if you do it for your internal pieces, there's still the entire ecosystem of stuff out there that you have to manage. The only way that we get to a better place is if someone can bring everybody along at the same time.
Well, and perhaps that's why we've seen such a diverse set or approach, right, of these NHI companies. And so, some, for example, like the Clutch Securities, which we've had on this podcast, and Oasis are tackling the management governance play, right, which is tell me what secrets or identities I even have, right, and how I'm managing them, versus the more Okta for NHI approach, similar to an Ambit, which we also had on this podcast, right? What do you think about those two very different approaches to tackling this problem?
Yeah, I think long term, the way I think about this market is that the NHI vendors are going to tell you have a problem, but their ability to help you fix this can be really limited. And the fundamental reason for that is the NHI products sit off to the side of the actual core production and engineering workflow. The people that are actually are managing these online services may or may not know the NHI products even exist. And so broadly speaking, I look at them as a great thing to tell you have a pain and to validate whether you have a pain or a risk, and potentially help you close some compliance and governance gaps, and maybe help you inform your scanners about where to go look where a potential secret could have been stored. And when it comes to things like Aimbit, this Okta for NHI, I think they're more interesting. And they're more interesting because they actually start trying to solve some of the core problem here. The core problem being, how do I govern what services inside my stack can communicate with what other services? And their approach was to come in as a security and platform tool and try to, over time, become a layer on top of those. And so broadly, I think anything in the space that's trying to actually become an active security management tool, which is how do I actively manage how service A and service B and C can communicate, are the long-term right choice in this space. And I largely believe that over time, that the companies that are trying to solve active service-to-service authentication authorization problems will eat the space away from the NHI vendors. And the reason I believe that is ultimately at the end of the day, in order to deploy something like an AIMBIT or other tools in the space, you have to get engineering buy-in. And it's really an engineering tool that gets deployed.
Yeah, I think you have some very, very interesting thoughts here, Ian. Something that I've not talked about previously at any of my podcasts on this topic, but I think you're the right person to sort of bring this topic up to, just based on a fascinating viewpoint that you bring on what's actually happening, what needs to happen. If you trace the history of identity, managed identities or human identities, they've gone through quite a bit of evolution in terms of creation, destruction, governance, and worrying about lost identities and what have you. Similar thing is happening in the NHI space, which is the rebrand of secrets. But there's one trend that I think the managed identity folks are trying to do, besides the federation part, cross-island collaboration. People are moving towards passwordless. Do you see a future of passwordless on NHI? Let's talk about that. I think that will be like eliminating the problem versus putting a band-aid on the thing.
I think we get to a world where we stop where we can. I think we can get to a world where we don't have shared secrets anymore. Like that's like OIDC is the bedrock to enabling that, I think, is how we get there. And so that would be great for everybody, is what you actually, instead of having a ton of shared secrets that have to be copied and pasted and orchestrated around and leaked, we end up with our bunch of, short-lived credentials that are runtime specific and tied to a specific identity that enable both parties to authenticate and authorize. And so we can sit and say that's like passwordless or not. I broadly believe that it is, in the sense that you have moved from a world of static to dynamic. And I think that's where we have to get to. And I think there's another reason that we're going to end up here. And while I think the actual core things that try to solve problems in the core stack of how your services communicate become a requirement, is that, with the rise of agents or AI, if you're ever going to have anything that's not attached to a human in your core stack, you need to authenticate and authorize that. And you want to have very specific guardrails about what it can communicate, how it can communicate, where it can communicate. And that's going to look a lot more real time and a lot more dynamic than anything that's ever come before. I think the idea that you'd ever allow, let's imagine a world where you have something that comes in and deals with log vacuuming or removing like unused metrics that aren't useful, right? Like that's a toil task that developers do, cost millions and millions of dollars for companies over time if they don't have and manage their metrics garden or their log garden. It's something a human doesn't want to do and a computer could easily automate. But if you're going to actually have like a piece of software that, and in order to solve that problem, you have to live both across production data, production stack, and code. If you're going to have something like that come in, like an agent, and do tasks like that for you, you're going to have very specific guardrails, and you're going to have very fine-grained permission and access controls for those agents. And so broadly, I believe that this is the reason over time that things like these governance tools, while they tell you have a pain, will never actually become and solve problem or be core to the workflow, the future workflow for engineers and security professionals.
Yeah, I kind of aligned with some of your thinking there, especially something that you said early on around stuff is not inbuilt into the protocol, and that's why we have this exhaust. I think if you take a look at the traditional world of people writing code for, packaging them as apps or services, the future world is definitely an agent version of that, right? And then as people are figuring out the new architectures for these agents, building it into the protocol, an OIDC-like thing, a passwordless-like thing, which allows for more close to action real-time validation of the access control model. That might be the way on Gateway to the Future on how to avoid all of these exhaust problems and have a passwordless future for non-human identity. I think that an NHI is going to explore even more in the agentic space if we don't do anything about it right now. So I think we're on to something here in terms of how to paint the future.
Absolutely. And I think one great example or thought process is to think about these custodial use cases. If you go look at the modern company in the mid-market, not the enterprise, but in the mid-market, it is a collection of hundreds and hundreds of different SaaS tools that are all interconnected together. every single one of those SaaS tools that connects to another SaaS tool, whether it's inside your production stack or it's using your, your revenue stream or using your marketing, all are custodians. They have secrets that access your data that they have to keep safe. And so if we think about the shared secret problem is a problem inside a core production stack, think about the shared secret problem they have to manage, right? And so broadly speaking, it's not just a problem inside how I have service A talk to service B, talk to a Postgres database and permission and govern those things. It's also how does a custodian of secrets authenticate and authorize to other different parts of the SaaS. So there's like a core internet infrastructure problem that is directly related to like the economics of how we build and run software across clouds, across regions that we have to solve because they all represent massive risk for everybody else and also are a big impediment to our ability to actually like connect software together. And I think the right solution in this space, when it comes along, if it comes along, will both solve problems for the custodian, they'll solve problems for the consumer of secrets. So, service A trying to connect to service B and some Postgres database, but also solve problems for the reducers and take us from a world where like this is an annoying problem that companies have, many large teams with big spend dedicated to solving this problem to a world where this is a forgotten thing. There's a piece of software and a protocol that we all know to use that is open, and we can get focused on solving the real problems, like how do we build value for the rest of humanity?
Yeah, I can see a future where producer takes the ownership of reducing the friction of auth for the custodian and the consumer. And I think the custodian has to be sort of given a free jail-free card here. The consumer has to have the least friction for it to all work.
Exactly. And if you think about like one of the greatest credential leaks in the last year, or year and a half now at this point, which is like the CircleCI breach in 2023, and how that led to all these downstream consequences for their customers, where they all had to go and rotate basically everything. Because if you had a secret that was in CI/CD that got leaked, that probably had a secret that led to production secrets, then you had to go rotate all your production secrets. So what happens if those got stolen before, right? Like these are core fundamental issues that exist because we operate on a shared secret paradigm where everyone's copying around API keys to different places. And so if you think about that, if we want to have a world, we have lots of custodians, which is where we are, and that continues to be worse, especially as you look at some of the new AI tools, we have to come out with a solution that solves producer, custodial, and consumer problems.
Yeah, I think the short-living nature of the token and the need to reauth based on exact signal of compromise and a fast-moving operation on when a reset needs to occur, that could offer a good balance between long-lived and short-lived overall. Building a piece of infrastructure that is smart today we are talking about things like ITDR. I think you need an ITDR engine for non-human so that these sort of TTLs could be managed better. There's always going to be trust until you have noticed something else, which is bad enough to reestablish trust based on a new token.
Absolutely. And I also think, like, broadly speaking, when we think about how we get there, the right solution in the space is going to help people get to the new world while supporting the legacy and do a smooth transition. And I think that's the absolute key to making this work, right? Like we're not talking about something where you can go with a wholesale new approach. You got to bring people to the promised land while supporting the legacy. And if you can't do that, then nothing's going to get off the ground.
The bridges between NHIs, I think companies like Ambit have a path to that transition. Everybody else that I see is pretty much solving other parts of the puzzle. They're not building the infra for NHI. They're not building the infra for NHI. They don't have a path to this short-lived token passwordless like looking future in the end.
Absolutely.
This is amazing. I'm loving this conversation. I think it's bringing the juices on in terms of creative thinking. You're absolutely right. From a practitioner land, I think when we build new systems and when the underlying tailwinds of technology change, it's often a good inflection point to introduce new mindsets because legacy is going to be legacy. It's running business operation that's creating genuine value, and people are trained to work a particular way. But I think with agents and AI in general, there is a huge opportunity here to actually plant the bug or plant the seed of a new way of doing things. So fascinating stuff. So super enjoying.
Absolutely. It's been such a pleasure. And I think the reality is that these are pain points we have today and in future, they just keep getting worse today. If AI didn't exist at all, And then AI just makes everything so much worse. So I think this is a space where we'll spend a lot more time. And it's a space where I think, there's a lot of money to be generated and a lot of revenue. But it's going to require a lot of new ways to think, and it's going to require companies that can involve all parties, not just the producer or the custodian, but needs to involve the consumer, and it also needs to involve all the different parties inside a business, whether it's the developer, the platform engineer, and the security engineer.
Bingo, let's improve that third order productivity, as you call the third delta or second delta.
Well, it's always a pleasure talking to folks who, built stuff in the wild and deployed things. So thanks for the riffing today.
Awesome.
Absolutely. Anytime.